Hey, everybody, welcome to Pink Shade. It's Tuesday. Normally, in this spot, we would have 90 Day Fiancé, but guess what? Matt Sharp actually takes a break for the Super Bowl. Who knew? He doesn't take a break for any other holiday, just the Super Bowl. But that's fine because I'm getting a chance to talk about a documentary that I'm really interested in. It's called Till Murder Do Us Part, Soering versus Haysom. It was on Netflix. It came out last year in 2023. I just recently found out about it a month or so ago, and I'm really not even sure why. I feel like a nephew maybe told me about it, but it takes place in Lynchburg, Virginia, and I have a lot of family there. So I did reach out to my aunt and my cousin who live there. They remember it very well. My cousin says she used to babysit in the house directly behind the Haysoms, and her mom said, "What are the chances there's going to be another double murder? You're fine to go over there and babysit." It was the 80s. It was the 80s. But it's very interesting, all the stuff about the state of Virginia and the governors being in power and the John Grisham, the Mississippi aspect of it all, which everybody knows. I'm from Mississippi. I'm a big John Grisham fan. So it was just a lot of this that intrigued me. So today I have a very special guest that you've probably heard many times over on our friend Kate Casey's podcast. It's Jodene Weber of Caught in My Web. She's a former FBI agent. She knows everything about everything, and she's going to break down this documentary. Welcome, Jody.
Thank you, Mary Payne. Thank you for having me.
Oh my gosh. So you and I were talking before, and you immediately were giving me some hot takes, and I'm like, save it for the pod, save it for the pod.
Try my best.
Okay. So when I asked you to watch this, had you watched it before? Had you heard of this before?
I had heard of it through Kate Casey. It was on one of her must-watch lists.
Yes.
But I had not watched it until you requested that I watch it. So
Okay.
I have, and I'm ready to go.
Okay. All right. So I'll give you guys the Netflix breakdown just in case you didn't watch it. Here's the Netflix 2-second description. It is on March 30th, 1985. Elizabeth Haysom's parents, Derek and Nancy, were brutally murdered. A young German expat named Jens Soering later confessed to and was convicted of the murders. Now, his girlfriend, Elizabeth, the daughter, was charged as an accessory. But Soering recanted his confession on the stand, and the trial became a high-profile case of he said, she said. Was Soering really the killer, or was he taking the fall for his girlfriend? And this documentary investigates the controversy surrounding it. Now, the whole thing is so fascinating, and I think this documentary is so well done, the way that they lay it out. So part one, we open with the murders, right? So it's brutal murder in this, lovely, secluded area of Lynchburg, Virginia. Lynchburg, Virginia is called the Seven Hills because it's surrounded by these mountains. It's gorgeous. It's a gorgeous town. It is a little, enclave. There are parts of it, in my opinion, that are a little more country with the K, and then there are parts that are fancy, So what we see the investigators talking to Elizabeth right away, and doesn't she seem very posh? Like, is she British? Wasn't that confusing at first?
Well, you do get the sense her boarding school background, or at least I did. And I did get the fact that I picked up right away on the fact that, she was raised by parents with an international connection, both to South Africa and to Canada. So I did find her to be more worldly.
Yes.
Right at the jump.
Yeah.
But I also picked up on her dichotomy. Her goth nature did not fit the mold, especially the mother, wanting to be
they're descendants of the Astors
family.
Yes.
And I'm like, okay, that doesn't go with the goth girl with the punk, Pat Benatar hairdo. At that time. And certainly I think the fact that she was dabbling either bisexual or lesbian at the time as a teenager, I thought at that time was rather, it's not like nowadays where, homosexuality or a lesbian teenage relationship would have been something that it would have been odd at that time. And I think for the community in that part of Virginia, I think that would be very striking and controversial to her mother in particular.
Yes. Yes, I think so. And then we find out about Jens. So Jens was not only an Eccles scholar, which is a big deal at UVA, but he was a Jefferson scholar. And just being, I've lived here longer than I lived in Mississippi. I know if you're a Jefferson scholar at UVA, like it's fully paid for, and UVA is Ivy League light. If you get into UVA, even my son's ex-girlfriend just got into UVA, like it's a huge deal to even get in. But to be a Jefferson scholar, I know one person ever, my friend Sabrina's sister, was a Jefferson scholar. Like it's huge. So he's an Eccles scholar and a Jefferson scholar. And right away we get the impression from anybody that met him that he was rude and arrogant and he was an outsider. And people right away were like, what does she, this like crazy punk, like telling all these stories of drug use and all this, what does she see in him? Right. So that's interesting. The one lady that was the reporter, but she had also been an Eccles scholar a year or two above them. Now, what I found interesting, which I didn't pick up on the first time I watched it, was that she was 2.5 years older than him. So he went in as a freshman at 18. She goes in as a freshman at 20 and a half.
Correct. And I really found that to be significant. And I
Yes.
do recall that comment from that one individual that was interviewed, like, what in the world did she see in him? I'll tell you what she saw in him. She saw someone she could manipulate and someone she could control.
Yes.
And I feel because of the age difference, she almost had like a Svengali type influence over him in that she wanted this murder committed and that he was moldable and he was willing and he was able. And she cast a spell on him. And it especially becomes clear when we get to the part about the letters that they exchanged and
Yeah,
the
wild.
comments they made to one another. How he expresses to her, I was nearing the edge and you reeled me back in and you saved me. And it was
Yes.
clear he was head over heels in
Oh,
love with
God.
Elizabeth.
I will read you some of these flowery words and deep thoughts that they say to one another. She says to him, I love you with pain. Age and decrepitude can have no terrors for me. Loss and vicissitude cannot appall me. Not even death can dismay me. Fixed in the certainty of love unchanging, I feel utterly secure in you. I'm a part of you.
Let me tell you, Mary Payne. Now, we're a few years younger than Elizabeth, but not by much, okay? So you and I, we were in high school in the 80s. Did you talk like that?
No.
No, no. So I find her writings not only to be manipulative and controlling, but very performative.
Yes.
There's a reason for, a method to her madness, so to speak. And I think he was one of those people, and we hear this a lot about Brian Koberger, about how they just think they're the smartest people in the room. And clearly he was intellectually very, very book smart. I don't think he had the street smarts. And I do think the fact that perhaps because he had such a challenging personality, the fact that this relatively attractive woman was, putting him up on a pedestal and stroking his ego and giving him the affirmations he was so craving, I think he did fall under her spell. And I think those letters were impactful to him. I think there's a reason they were saved. And quite frankly, I think they led to his downfall.
Yes. And he mentions that he writes her some things, but they're not quite as flowery as angsty because I don't think he's got that, But he says he finally felt someone understood him. And of course, the other thing was sex, right? He's a virgin. He goes to college. He meets this woman who's worldly and knows all these things and is going to like teach him. And of course, he's an 18-year-old boy having sex. So of course, now she's got him where she wants him, right? This is the way I'm picturing it. So now we see the investigators talking about the mileage on this rental car. And I found this so interesting right away because sometimes back when you see stuff from the 80s and stuff, you're like, oh, they missed it or they don't know what we know today. And even 20 years from now, I'm sure we'll say things about, today's times. But it was interesting that he said you had these 600 something miles on the car, but really you should have only had like 100 and something. So what was that 429 miles unaccounted for? And then they drive it. It's the exact mileage from the Marriott Hotel to the Haysom house in Lynchburg. And he's like, well, we drove around a lot or we got lost. He was like, you were lost for like 8 hours? Like what? And they didn't have much of an answer for that. I felt like that was an oversight on their part if they were trying to get away with it.
Big oversight. Additionally, when we look at the crime scene, it was so savage. I mean,
Mm,
the one investigator says in episode 1, it was like a slaughterhouse.
hmm
And you look at the throat slashings and the
hmm
multiple stab wounds, there was clear overkill. And to any trained investigator, that suggests personalization.
hmm
That suggests this isn't just a random home intrusion. This is personal. Who had a personal vendetta against this couple, these parents?
Right.
And so I think for law enforcement, once they were able to eliminate other family members and to be able to look at business associates and anyone who would have had some sort of motivation, I think the thing that tripped up Elizabeth, aside from Jens, is that she didn't seem to emote. She lacked empathy and she was almost too controlled, too subdued about this savage killing.
hmm
And then when they did look into the rental car and saw the fact that the mileage did sync up
hmm
almost to the tenth of a mile, I mean, it was
hmm
so perfect. That's when their story started to fall apart. And then, of course, when they fled, I mean, that's a huge red flag right there.
Yeah,
Huge red flag.
they flee. They go on the run for 6 months. They go all over Europe, then to Thailand, and they were showing this on the map, right? Which is good for people like me who don't understand geography. I was like, okay, so they're all over like Yugoslavia, this, that, and the other, then all the way to Thailand, all the way back to England, and they before they left these letters for their family and the investigators, right? And it seems like Jens kind of makes a poke at one of the investigators, and you wonder if that was his ego or if that was her saying to do that. But they run out of money, so they get caught in sort of a check writing scheme in London, and they get put in jail there for this check writing scheme, and they go to the apartment and they gather all this stuff. Well, one of the investigators thinks, well, I'm just going to read all these diaries and letters. And the other one's like, I don't know why he was doing that. But thank God he did, because they realize now something terrible has happened in Virginia. This is all from the 80s, right? Like these days it would be totally different. But they see these names of these two investigators in the journals. They call over to Bedford County, Virginia. Do you have these two guys here? Do you know these people? Are the parents dead? And like, crazy. And the guy's like, we gotta get on a plane and go over there. And these guys get on a plane, they go to England, they interview them. The Brits are interviewing them. They're interviewing them separately. Elizabeth immediately gets a lawyer and is not cooperative, gives no answers. And he chose not to have a solicitor. And they said he was in full control. He was very confident. Now, the story that they're telling is Jens says he left Elizabeth in DC. She went to a movie. He was completely alone. He went to the Haysom house in Lynchburg, and he wasn't completely sure what was going to happen, but he did kill them. He reenacts the whole murder and confesses. Wow.
Correct. Now,
Wow.
here's what's interesting. Several things here. First off, the crime scene, there was quite a bit of forensic evidence there. We see, various shots and footage of the blood spatter and
Mm-hmm.
footprints. And I know
Mm-hmm.
even in that first episode where that one law enforcement officer said it was a slaughterhouse, right when he says that on the screen, you see a bloody footprint. And I'm like, well, there's foot tread right there. We eventually hear about a cigarette that's left there. We hear about hair in the bathroom sink. We hear that one or more perpetrators took a shower there at the residence. So to me, again, that screams someone feeling very comfortable, knowing no one's going to stop by this residence, familiar with the routine, etc.
Mm-hmm.
So when we get to the ultimate arrest and the interviews in London, I do think the fact that Jens had this superior book smart sense about him.
Mm-hmm.
I know I once had an informant, and he used to tell me almost at every meeting, well, you know, I'm a genius, right? You know, I'm a genius. I'm like my IQ level, I'm a genius. And every time he would say that, I would cringe because I'm like, well, you're not smart enough to know that you shouldn't be saying that to people because people are going to think you're stupid for saying something. Because
Yeah.
nobody who's really a genius would say that because it's so off-putting.
It's
But I
off-putting.
think,
Yes. Yes.
yeah, I think Jens had this, I'm smarter than you, and I will be able to answer any question that you toss at me. And then ultimately, I think he thought he would have immunity because of
Right.
who his father was.
Mm-hmm.
And I
Mm-hmm.
think that played into a factor. I think he thought, well, I'll take the fall for Elizabeth because I'll have diplomatic immunity. And then she'll get off scot free. I'll be her knight in shining armor.
Uh-huh.
And I don't think he anticipated as soon as, the gig was up and law enforcement was on the hot trail, she dumped him, and she
Yes.
dumped him fast.
She dumped him. She wrote him a letter, of course, because that's what they did, severing their relationship. And she says, I'll go back to Virginia. I'll admit my role, but I don't love you anymore. You're on your own. So she was extradited in 1987 back to Virginia, and she admitted to guilty to accessory before the fact. But then there's like a hearing, and it's all about the why. It's all about the why. And her answer is, as we go into part 2, her answer is, my parents died because Jens and I were obsessed with each other, and he was jealous of anybody else in my life. Now that's a new spin, right? So, okay, so we understand that they're taking, they're both saying that they did it or whatever, but the crux of the case comes to who planned it. Who planned it out, who said they were going to DC, who bought these movie tickets, who did all this. Then she says on the stand, we still have it today, that Jens has an impotency problem. But after, he killed the parents, he wasn't impotent anymore. What did you think about that? About her being like, and I'm going to say his dick doesn't work, like right on the stand.
Well, that obviously contradicts with the way he's displayed this
Right.
entire story. I mean, he feels like, hey, I was a virgin until I met her, and then she rocked my world.
Yes.
So, I mean, the thing that is clear all the way through this, whether you're talking about impotency or whether you're talking about the killings, one of them's lying. One of
Yes.
them is clearly lying because when you look at the letter writing and the comments made in the letters about how she says things about being comfortable and okay with the deaths,
Mm-hmm.
and he says, well, I can already see the dinner scene, and law
Yes.
enforcement believes they were killed around the dinner hour because there was a table setting
Yeah.
and food out. And then the fact that the father had, like voodoo symbols carved into his chin. And then Jens makes a comment about voodoo in one
Mm-hmm.
of the letters. There clearly was joint premeditation, in my opinion, based on what is in the letters. One knew what the other was planning. And given how he refers to her as saving him, she was the puppet master. She was the
Yes.
control one, and she's the one that would have the motivation. She, in my opinion, on the stand was spinning why it would be a motivator for him to kill. She knew I've got to have a motivation for him because
Yeah.
really she's the one that would benefit. She would inherit financially. If you believe her mother was molesting her, which I do, I say I do,
Okay.
that would be her motivation. That would be the hatred and the reason for the overkill. The fact that this mother allegedly had molested her, according to Elizabeth, and the father looked the other way, turned a blind eye.
And the cousin Phyllis later says something was happening there. I don't want to speak to it, but I do think the father turned the blind eye. I mean, the cousin even says it,
Yes, and
which
then
was
those
interesting.
pictures that were found, the naked pictures, that's highly unusual.
But the
Highly
question,
unusual.
the naked pictures to me, I was kind of like, a boyfriend could have taken those pictures, and she could have said her mother took the pictures because the pictures were just new pictures of her. So I didn't think the pictures were.
I think it depends what age she was when those pictures were taken.
Okay, good point.
Too.
That's a good point.
I mean,
Yeah.
if it was when she was prepubescent
Yeah.
or, a younger teenager, I just think it's odd they were found in her parents' house. Of course, now she could have planted them there to your
Yeah.
point. But I do think the fact that family members also have indicated, okay, there was something else going on there.
Mm-hmm.
To me, I think it makes me think of the Menendez brothers, quite frankly, because they have alleged the exact same thing, that was
Mm-hmm.
the reason for killing their parents.
Right.
And
You're right.
I think there is a lot of evidence, at least in the last year, to suggest that, the father to the Menendez brothers, there were a
Right.
lot of questions about him,
Yes.
potentially, molesting young boys in the music industry.
Yes.
So I kind of correlate that to this case and I say, okay, well, let's just take that as our working hypothesis. That would give her a motivation for overkill and to savagely kill. And what she needed was someone to help her because when you have two people, it helps to have a co-conspirator there with you because while you're attacking one, what's to prevent the other one from running away, driving away, getting a weapon and coming back at you?
Yes. Right.
You need a second perpetrator.
Yeah. I mean, that's like what they said, excuse me, at the beginning. He said, I couldn't, it seemed like it would have to be a gang of people would have to come in and do this. Like it seemed like such overkill that there's no way one person could have done this. They did say that the dad was killed at the dinner table and then kind of fell. And then mom was killed seemingly as she was trying to run out. Now, as it goes, he's still in England. She's back in Virginia. And he's saying he can't believe what he's seeing in the press, like what she's doing and with things she was saying. He's waiting for extradition to Germany. He's writing nonstop. He's facing the death penalty if he goes to Virginia. So he asked to go to the European Court of Human Rights in France. I've never heard of this, to help him so that if he did go to Virginia, he wouldn't face the death penalty. And this ends up working. So he is extradited back to Virginia, but they say, okay, we won't give him the death penalty if he's guilty. So back on the stand, we see the prosecutor asking, like, why did you refer to yourself as Lady Macbeth? Lady Macbeth persuaded Macbeth to commit murder. Later, she says, did nobody read this? Of course, she was the one that felt guilty and he realized his true self. But nobody, again, she's being a little bit like, am I the smartest one here? Duh. So she says she had no idea that Jens would murder her parents. And that's when the prosecutor's like, listen, we know you're the puppet master. And he has her read from some of these writings. Mm-hmm. She says when she was younger, she felt rejected by her parents. She was always being sent off to school. Mm-hmm. They never came to her lacrosse matches. They never came to her performance. Nothing. She was in Switzerland. She was in England. She felt deep rejection. But then once she got on drugs and started acting out, they brought her back to Virginia, and then they gave her too much attention. How they got her into UVA on a scholarship, I don't know. Anyway, so because of their prominence,
their connection. I guess. Sure.
Yeah, and then she said, like, she was smothered, and her mother would just show up at UVA, which is not very far. Then the prosecutor drops the bomb about the sexual relationship, and she says, I don't want to talk about that. My mother's not here. It's private. It's painful. And he's like, you've said your mother was an abuser. You said she's an alcoholic. And she was like, I don't know if I said that. And they said, now you're saying she sexually abused you. And if you think she didn't do it, you should clear her name. And then she says, no, she never sexually abused me.
I didn't believe her.
You didn't believe? I don't believe anything she says.
Well,
anything.
See, and that's the thing. That's the thing that we need to look at here is the fact that Elizabeth, her lack of empathy, it goes towards narcissism. It goes towards her psychopathy. She will say what she needs to for her. Mm-hmm. And so when it works for her to say her mother abused her, She says it. And
Right.
certainly, given the fact that other family members support it, to me, that's the key indicator. The people who don't have a manipulation or, a dog in the fight, so to speak, they don't have any reason to tarnish this victim's reputation unless they truly believe, yes, something was going on there.
Yeah.
And I do think the fact that her half siblings on the father's side, the fact that they maintain a relationship with her to this day, to me suggests that they have some reason to have sympathy for her.
Mm-hmm.
And so, because they could easily just, this is only our half sister. We don't need to maintain a relationship with her. Look at what she caused to happen.
Mm-hmm.
The fact they haven't cut ties with her tells me that maybe they do understand that she was potentially a victim herself of improper conduct by her mother.
Because
And maybe their father looked the other way and was complicit by, not stopping it.
and then the siblings that are from her mother's first marriage turned their back on her, the brothers, because it seems that, well, because she's
That's their
saying
mother,
that
right?
about their mother. Yeah.
Correct.
And okay, so then she says, then the UVA alum, that's the reporter, says she's a pathological liar. She literally lies about everything. She lies about these homes that she has. She lies about little things. She lies about big things. She lies about everything. And then on the stand, she says, as you can see from my letters, I deceived people. I exaggerated. I played roles. I acted out roles. And then she explains that after the murder is when she decided to use this movie as an alibi. And then she decided to buy dinner for two at the hotel so it looked like two. And this shows how involved she was. She says she's the prosecutor saying you're not being honest. It's showing how involved you were, that you were thinking about the alibi. And she said, look, here's the thing. I am responsible for manipulating Jens, but he acted on his free will. He had a choice. He had a 4-hour drive to think of it. What'd you think of that? She's like, I mean, it's not my fault he did it.
Well, I think what she's doing there is she's backpedaling and she's trying to say, well, yeah, I knew he was going to do it, and yeah, I helped him cover it up, but I didn't hold a gun to his head. He went and did it. But I also think he eventually does the same thing, and basically you have each of them pointing their fingers ultimately at the other one,
Yes.
saying, yes, we both knew it was going to happen. Yeah, we both knew it happened after the fact, and we fled together. But once we were caught, I'm pointing my finger at her, and she's pointing the finger at him. Now, the order of the food in the hotel and the movie tickets are very controversial because many people have accused the filmmakers of not including all the facts on that.
Oh, okay. Tell me.
So they're saying in the movie that when the dinner was ordered, that the documentary didn't state that dinner order, the meal that was ordered, wasn't available until after 5:30 p.m.
Okay.
So
Okay.
that to me was an interesting detail. Additionally, they say at the end of the documentary, well, one of them could have just gone and purchased the movie tickets in advance, several hours in advance for the various shows. And then depending when they needed a movie ticket for, they would
Yeah.
have the 10 p.m. ticket. But according to what I've researched, later on, the movie theater manager said that based on the serial numbers on the tickets,
Mm-hmm.
it would seem that the 10 o'clock showing tickets were a serial number that was purchased between 8 and 10 p.m. Now, to me, if you arrive in Lynchburg around the dinner hour, which you would assume that's when the victims were sitting down to have dinner, like
Mm-hmm.
at a normal dinner hour, and you murder them, and then you hop in the shower quick, and then you hop back in your car. It's a 3-hour drive or so from Lynchburg to DC. If you committed the killings and you're out of there by 6:30, you could be back in DC by 9:30, and buy those movie tickets before 10 o'clock. So really, to me, the movie tickets don't really tell us anything. They still could have been together.
Mm-hmm.
The confusing part to me is the dinner order.
Right.
And I wonder, could they have called? Do we know for sure the call came from in the hotel, or
Uh-huh.
was it just to the hotel ordering? Could the call have come from the road, from a payphone?
It'd have to be a
That's,
payphone, yeah.
yeah, that to me was the only thing that I wasn't super clear on because, and then who accepted the food? What time was the food accepted at? That was another thing I wasn't clear on. Was it just left outside the door? I'm
No, because
unclear
somebody
about that.
signed for it. And
Someone signed for it.
that's another
Yeah.
thing that they say, that because they don't have that receipt from the signing, that they can't do the comparison of who did it and also the exact time. So that was a huge mistake on their part. So, so June of 1990, okay, so first of all, she's sentenced to 2 counts of accessory, 45 years in prison for each charge, so 90 years. So that's what she's sentenced to. So in June 1990, it's a total media circus in Bedford County. I can't imagine how this little, like, cute little town could even handle this. But we see Jens, we see his dad, Claus, very concerned about Claus's bags under his eyes. It's very he looked like he
Don't look at mine.
don't look at mine. So they call Jens to the stand. He says he did not do it. He did not go to that home and kill them. So then we go into part 3, right? So he says the first part of that day, he was with Elizabeth. Elizabeth told him, she has this drug problem. And, and that's believable because everybody knew she'd been on drugs before. And if you're on heroin, sometimes you just don't really get off of it. It doesn't always really happen that way for heroin users. So he says she had a drug problem and she had a drug debt. So to help with the drug debt, she had to go to DC. She had to pick up this package and drive it to Charlottesville. So back to where UVA is. He needed to stay there in DC as an alibi. He needs to go get these movie tickets. He needs to order the food. He needs to be the alibi. She's going to drive to Charlottesville and back. And he says he couldn't go with her to Charlottesville because he looks too nerdy, which he does. Everybody describes him as being, look, they're like, this guy. And when you see him, you're like, nerds, nerds, nerds. He does look like a nerd. So he went to the hotel. He ordered the room service. He saw 3 movies. Then she came back to DC and she says, I killed my parents. Drugs made me do it. They deserved it anyway. And she says over and over and over that the drugs made her do it. He was terrified. And she's like, you got to help me. It's me and you against the world. And he says this is how he's justifying it. It's just the 2 of them. He loves her so much. He would accept the blame. It would be, what did he say? He says a festival of literature. It would be like A Tale of Two Cities and Macbeth and Romeo and Juliet. And everything was a performance. And he had to confess believingly. So they talked for hours, figured out their story. They figured out how they came up with the story. And then he thought he was a hero. And like you said, his dad's a diplomat. He's only 18. He'll just go to jail for 5 years in Germany. It's an easy sacrifice to get his whole life with this woman.
Right. Who he believed would still be there for him.
Right. It's, you and I we're watching this like, okay, we know girls like this. Like, she's just using him. So then we get evidence of all sorts of shoddy police work, right? We get the movie tickets coming to evidence. We have the room service receipt that would have shown a lot, but they don't have it. The crime scene, there are Merit cigarette butts found. She smoked Merit cigarette.
Very significant.
He doesn't smoke.
Right. And I mean, especially with DNA and saliva and
yes,
that to me, and then the hair in the sink and the shower. I just think her fingerprints are all over it. And I'm saying that colloquially. I do think
her fingerprints were in a vodka bottle.
Right.
And they're
now,
like,
she may have been there before, but, okay, let's say the parents are seated at the dining room table and she goes up and she walks up behind the father, slices his throat. Mother gets up in a panic. Could Elizabeth run after the mother, catch her, and then attack her, fatally stab her, then go back and commit rage against the father?
Yes.
Yes, but
But
I
remember,
think it's much.
mom is a drinker and she's in a house coat, which by the way, I love a house coat. But mom's a drinker and she's in her house coat and it's dinner time and she's always and Elizabeth's always talking about mom's into her sixth drink and all this and mom fell into a fire, all this. Mom's a drunk, okay? According to Elizabeth. So if mom is a drunk and she's trying to run away and she's in a house coat, she may have tripped. I mean, maybe Elizabeth didn't even have to catch her.
Well, right. A
Yeah.
lot of like when she says a house coat back in the 80s, those were like moo-moos,
It's a moo. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
Gorgeous.
So, to me though, it just seems a two perpetrator crime.
It does. Okay.
It does. And I think also the controversy over the blood that was left at the scene, was it foreign DNA? Was it really just the father's DNA? All the controversy over that. Now that's another component. Jens argues that the O blood type doesn't match him necessarily. However, they say when I did research, they said, look, those samples were potentially contaminated based on how they were stored. So we really can't
Yeah.
factor anything in or out based on those samples. So that
Yeah.
to me is problematic. But the
Yeah.
footprint
Yeah. Let's talk about
problems,
that. Okay.
that's to me,
Okay. So there's footprints, right?
right.
So okay. So we get, first of all, we go into this super jazzy 80s Miami Vice music and we get Jim Updike, the prosecutor. It was such a turn with like all this series and we get this like it's like
Miami Vice.
yes, like Miami Vice. And here's Jim Updike, the prosecutor. They say he's super fashion conscious. He loves a three-piece suit. He's flamboyant. He's entertaining. He has a white Corvette. And he always tries to say, like, well, I'm just a country boy. And they're like, mm-mm.
No, you're not.
So, and they're saying, like, Jen's taking the stand against this guy is risky because this guy's like super like slick and smart and Jen's is like this nerd. So we see Jim Updike doing like all these reenactments of the murder and being like super flamboyant. And before we talk about the sock print, I want to ask you about this dead dog at the side of the road. Because when Jens describes it, he says, "Did you guys see a dead dog?" And they're like, "What?" And he goes, "Because I think when I was leaving, I hit a dog and I wanted to make sure it was okay." And they said, "What? You just killed two people, but you care about hitting a dog?" He said, "Well, the dog never did anything to me." So they're like, if he's worried about a dog, why would he interject that detail? And he confessed 3 times to 3 different groups of people to the murder. But on the stand, he comes across as like, there's no way. So the thing about the dog, I'm wondering if that's a detail she told him, like, make sure you say you hit a dog on the way out. So if they see this dead dog, like, I think she told him to say that detail because they were like, huh? You hit a dog? What'd you think about the dead dog thing?
To me, that was a bit of a red herring.
Mm-hmm.
It really was. It was like, well, did she hit the dog or did he hit the dog? Again,
Right.
it's confusing to me. I think, it does seem like, well, why would you care about a dog?
Right.
And, when you've savagely committed, this horrible murder, or your girlfriend has committed this murder, but you're worried about a dog. But I think to me, it really shows again how, he's supposed to be this genius, but 2 plus 2 doesn't equal 4 there.
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah.
it's just nonsensical.
Okay, let's talk about the sock print. So they show the sock print at the scene, and then they do an overlay of Yen's sock print. Now, the thing with Yen's sock print is they said that he didn't give it until like 1995 years later. They kept asking him, and he wouldn't give it, and he wouldn't give his blood. So the type O is 45% of the population, shows nothing. But the sock print, they're doing an overlay. They're showing exactly how it does. Later, we hear somebody say it's junk science, and then later we hear a forensic podiatrist explain why it's not junk science. What's your opinion?
I do think the splay between the big toe and the second toe was significant.
You do? Okay.
Yes, because that is your foot structure. Now, I know a couple things from working with the FBI laboratory. We have footprint, shoe print experts.
Right.
And I
A
mean,
forensic podiatrist this woman was.
right. And
Wow.
so, I mean, you can figure out, does a foot have a bunion? What is the splay between the toes? What is the length of the foot? What is the size of the shoe? What is the brand of the shoe tread? All that kind of, all those things experts in this field have. Now, however, I will mention that you can have experts in this field that can work 25, 30, 35 years. And then they retire. And then they realize that, if I put myself on the circuit to be expert witnesses for the defense, they'll pay me $10,000 for 2 hours of testimony, and I'll just come in and say, no, this is junk science, even though I spent 35 years of my life working in this field. We see that a lot with ballistics testimony, where, firearms examiners and tool marking examiners will completely spend their entire lives working that, and then they retire, and then they realize, well, I can just say it's not really scientific, and I can get paid a boatload of money, and who cares if people say, well, you're a hypocrite, you're completely contradicting your life's work. What do I care as long as I get a check with multiple zeros in it and a couple commas, that kind of thing. So I do think when you look at the footprints and specifically the spacing between the toes, the big toe and the second toe, to me, that was impactful. Okay. Even though it's not definitive, to me, that is strong circumstantial evidence. So I do think that, to me, tells me he was there, but the Merit cigarette tells me Elizabeth was there.
Yeah, he says if you look at the actual footprint, the length of it is actually more like her foot. He's like, it says nothing, and Gordon, I'm like, you're not an expert, shut up. So,
well, I want to know about her toes then.
Yeah, why didn't we get a footprint of her toes?
I want to see pictures of their feet without socks on them, and then I want to see that bloody footprint, and I want all three up on a screen.
And overlay it all to see what Matt. Yeah.
Yes, that's what I want.
Well, so Updike calls Elizabeth Haysom to testify, and Ian said, I don't know why all these years I was thinking she would tell the truth. But he said, they say literally they show him sitting at the table, and he looks like a little boy, nerd with the big glasses. He's like Urkel. And she comes up, gorgeous haircut, triple pierced ears. She looks like a full-grown woman.
Very cosmopolitan. Yes.
Very chic, right?
Very sophisticated.
So they say, okay, so that when they show the two together, her lawyer didn't do any favors and Menendez her up with the sweaters and try to look innocent. She looked like a fancy lady. So she says, when they're asking her about the whole thing about him leaving and going and coming back, she says, I was more concerned he was going to not kill them. And they said, what do you mean? And she laughs. She goes, I mean, it's fascinating to think of him killing anyone. And you're like, you're on the stand, ma'am. What? She's already been convicted, so what does she care?
Well, and that just shows her diabolical nature. It really does.
She laughs. There's never any, I can't believe my parents are dead. I can't believe I had a hand in my parents being dead. Nothing. Correct. So then the defense attorneys are going to question her. But she was sick that day, and they say when she goes to the stand, she looks completely different because she looks like worried now. And the attorney is trying to prove that Jens had no motive, but Elizabeth had all the motive. And this is when Phyllis, the cousin, says, Derek, there were some things where he looked the other way, and there's more to it that I won't divulge. That's what she says. Then Jens' attorney has her read a letter that she wrote to him, to somebody, somewhere. Basically, she hates men. All she wants is to manipulate them, screw them, make them hate themselves for loving her. She wants to humiliate them, then have them give in to her, give them the best fuck, and then walk out. And she's like, yeah, I said that. That's how I felt. And you're like, okay. And then there's a reporter there who says they fed into each other's extreme pathologies. It was a horrible puzzle that fit together.
Yes.
But
Yes.
her saying all of that is another thing. It's like, look what I can make this guy do for me.
Well,
Is the way
right.
I saw it. Yeah.
Right. Very much. She's the puppet master. She had that Svengali like control over him.
Hmm.
And given her, even if it was dabbling in lesbianism as or bisexuality as a teenager, clearly she was more into women at one point than she was into men.
So she hates men. She's trying to like
Right.
take out her hatred of men onto these guys and be like, I'm going to fuck you and then I'm going to leave you and then I'll go back to what I really want is to be with a woman. Yeah.
Right. You're disposable.
Disposable.
You are an end to a means or a means to an end.
Oh God, it
So
was
I
wild.
think it is. It is. And keep in mind, even though he's book smart, he was so vulnerable emotionally
Yeah.
and psychologically. I mean, she was giving him attention that really he didn't have. And I mean, we hear that about Koberger in his interpersonal relationships with women. And I
Yes.
don't think that can be emphasized enough about how that is a trigger and a weakness. And that, he was moldable. She was able to influence him and manipulate him. And he, in many respects, and to his own admission, will say, yes, I was a willing participant in that.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Oh my God. It's so when you hear some of these things that she writes, we're like, girl, don't put that in writing. But Neaton, which is Yen's attorney, says the motive and the reason to kill is hers. The evidence shows she was there, and all her stories that she tells never turn out to be true. But Updike says the evidence shows that Jens was there. So the jury sits for 13 days and 8 hours. They listen to both sides. And I think they said they reached a consensus in 4 hours, a verdict in 4 hours, after asking to see the sock print again.
And the overlay is what was
Mm-hmm.
convincing
Yeah.
to them. And now it's interesting because when we get to episode 4 and the whole spin of John Grisham comes in,
So happy.
John
I love
Grisham,
John
I mean,
Grisham.
that, talk about shocking. I didn't see that coming at all.
Either. I
And
didn't
I
either.
love him. I love John Grisham, but pay careful attention to what he says because it's his sheriff friend who contacts him and says, hey, John, take a look at this.
Mm-hmm.
And John says, well, the fatal mistake was Jens confessing.
Yes.
Now, that is different than saying he could have been proven guilty. That's what John Grisham is saying. Like, without that confession, all they would have had was that circumstantial overlay. He probably wouldn't have been convicted based on just that overlay. But notice what John Grisham isn't saying. He's not saying he's innocent. He's just saying he wouldn't have been convicted. There's a difference there.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that's an important distinction. However, given the fact he went to all that trouble to contact his political affiliates and affiliations to try to get this guy out of prison, maybe he did have some sort of compassion for him in that he did feel that this was a young, impressionable 18-year-old who was manipulated.
Yes. Yes. And it's sort of like when we get to it, he sort of says like, okay, he's been in prison long enough. Like, so.
And there are prosecutors who will tell you that there are murderers that, murder people like say the Menendez brothers. There are
Right.
people that would say, you could let those guys out today. They're not going to murder anybody else. They don't have a beef with anybody else. They lost it against their parents.
Right.
So maybe that is the thought about Jens in that he doesn't want to murder anybody else. He's not a homicidal maniac that's going to go out and murder anybody else. And he served his time and he was manipulated. And why should we take up prison space and pay for him behind bars if he's not going to be a threat to society anymore?
Yeah. Yeah. Did you think it was interesting that 4 months after the verdict, he was on Geraldo? I mean, some of this 80s stuff is just so wild to me. And he was like, I'm just mad. I was convicted of a crime. I'm innocent. And so then we go into part 4 with all these appeals.
Right.
Right. The Geraldo of it all, though, It's like, so
And Geraldo's still out there today.
Still out there.
Yeah.
Same mustache. So then they go. So we go into part 4, and Yin says they have a false confession, my blood type, and a sock print. And he pursued every avenue. He found lawyers. He found influential people to help him. We meet Chip Harding, this former sheriff. And then John Grisham comes on our screen, and everybody says amen. So we see and hear clips of his confession in England. He describes the wrong clothes that the Haysoms were wearing. And this is when he was really committed to his story and thought he would, get off scot-free because he was a diplomat's son. He describes the wrong description of the angle of the bodies, where they were. He literally says the mom is wearing jeans. She's in her muumuu. Mm-hmm. So also some things that he described happening with the dad screaming out, "What are you doing, boy?" happened after he said he'd slashed his windpipe. And the pathologist says that couldn't have happened, right? So then we talk about the junk science of the sock print impression. Jens pursues every legal avenue. He never stops trying to prove his innocence. Where, meanwhile, Elizabeth's in prison. She's a model inmate. She keeps quiet. She publishes a weekly article called Glimpses from the Inside, where she waxes poetic about a spider on her window shield. Her window shield, excuse me. So sorry, she didn't have a window shield. On her window sill. Her cousin Phyllis says her time in prison, she would say yes, she belonged there. She was guilty. She was remorseful. She admitted guilt. Meanwhile, Jens wrote a book called Mortal Thoughts. He was persistent. He pushed himself. He sold himself. He never stopped proclaiming his innocence. He was phoning. He was letters. We see interviews in the early 2000s. He looks exactly like Fred Armisen, like not kind of, like exactly like Fred Armisen from SNL. Then he becomes involved in Catholicism.
And gets very religious.
He befriends a deacon. And that deacon, because he's in prison in Richmond, becomes convinced of his innocence. Tim Kaine, our governor at that time, is Catholic. Now, this is where I'm watching this downstairs earlier today, and my husband comes in the room. My husband is a lobbyist in D.C., has been for 30 years, so obviously he understands a lot about politics. He's like, "Is Tim Kaine in this documentary that you're watching?" And then a few minutes later, he's like, "Wait a minute, is that Governor McDonnell?" I was like, "You can't come in the 4th episode. I asked you yesterday if you wanted to watch this, and you said no." He's like, "What are you watching?" So it's just so many crossovers with my life. I'm so fascinated by this. So he's about to get out in 2010. Tim Kaine, as his last act as governor, says he can get out, whatever that's called.
Right.
Then Elizabeth decides, she's going to speak up. She hasn't spoken this whole time, 20 years she hasn't spoken. And then she says he should not be let out. He is as guilty as she is, and they both deserve to be in prison. He had his bags packed, ready to go. Bob McDonnell takes office and says, nope, he can't go. He can't go back to Germany. What did you think about that? That was pretty interesting.
That
right?
was a twist.
Yeah.
That was a twist. And I mean, can you imagine, you think this is finally my out. I'm finally, making inroads here. This is finally going to happen. And then she 86s him. I mean, and I mean, that to me, I mean, he just must have such hatred for her.
I know. It's a good thing.
Such hatred.
Can he go to Canada? Because they can't.
I was going to say they can't come to the United
States.
States, but he could probably go to Canada. But I think, I mean, just I feel like they're both such liars and both such manipulators that when it worked together for them, they were all in. But then as soon as, the relationship broke off, it was every man or woman for themselves. And then it was like game on. It was like a bad divorce. How there's just those divorces, like the War of the Roses, so to speak. It was like that. And it was like, come hell or high water, she was going to stick it to him again. And she did.
Yeah. So he holds out. Okay, so there's no way out now. So Elizabeth Haysom this whole time is model prisoner. She's holding out hope for the parole board. Her cousin Phyllis says she went before the parole board many times trying to help her get out, to show she's not a threat to anyone. Like you said, like the Menendez brothers, she wasn't a threat to anyone, maybe only these people that she hated. It was always denied. Now, in 2016, they've been in prison for 30 years. Blood samples and crime scene evidence are tested for DNA. Like it's all put in, like, old crime scenes are coming up. So the blood stains on the clothes will be tested. No crime scene blood at all matches Yin's. Okay. His DNA was not found at the scene, but AB blood was also found with the Y chromosome, which would indicate a second male was bleeding at the scene. So then we go into this whole theory of two unidentified men being at the scene, drifters. So when I'm hearing this, I'm like, oh my God, she convinced two dudes
Two
that
other
she
guys.
drugs with in Lynchburg to do this for her. And she went, smoked cigarettes, watched her do it, and left. We've solved it. Nope. Guess what? Didn't match these guys either. These guys are currently in prison. Had nothing to do with them.
Correct. And then there is the controversy over whether there was even actually foreign DNA or whether it was just contaminated DNA from one of the victims.
Yes.
So it's so questionable. And we've had so many, even in the last 5 years, so many advancements in DNA. And even though they didn't find his DNA back then, now with like the MVAC machine and some of the new DNA technology collection devices, they can find microscopic DNA that they weren't able to find. Even, 10 years ago, we can now find it. So I'd be curious, was there really no DNA there? Or is it just we didn't have the technology to find the DNA there?
Yeah, they said that. So this in 2016, they say the DNA proves nothing other than the two victims were at the scene. Like that's it. You can't prove anything else. So then we see that Jens, this is a little spin against Jens here, that he would contact the press a lot about his case, but it was always specially curated information. Of course, because he's trying to prove his case. I mean, I'm like, okay. But then we see this forensic podiatrist who says it's absolutely not junk science. And she goes through what you're saying about if you lay the footprint this way, and the toes and all this. Now, Virginia, they say, is not a state that often releases people, but it has become now such a huge issue that Angela Merkel spoke to Barack Obama about it. Then we had another former president of Germany going to speak to the parole board on his behalf. So this is when JOHN GRISHAM says it came to a point where Jens had been in long enough, so he just had to leave. He just had to get out. And he said, basically, I've got a lot of pull. If a Democrat is in power, I've got a lot of pull. And he was able to use some influence over Governor Ralph Northam, which is then my husband's like, is Ralph Northam on this? I was like, get out of here.
Well,
get out of here.
A few thoughts on all of that. First of all, I think that's very scary that all you need to be is, high profile author or a big time donor. Really, that's what the connection is there.
Yes.
If you donate a lot of money, you've got potential influence over who gets paroled and who gets the phone call to the parole board. And certainly don't forget that Jens's father was an influential diplomat.
Right.
So he's got pull, and certainly he's got connections, and he's got people that will financially back those other politicians in Germany. And so it's scary to me how much the political influence can impact, whether or not people who were in some way, shape, or form connect. I mean, both have admitted we knew this was done. It's just a matter of which one of us did it.
Yes.
The fact that they're out there now. Now, are they a danger to other people? We don't think so. We hope not. But, people have said the same thing about the Manson family members. And, I happen to know, there was the one Manson family member who was just let out last spring. And some of the victims' family members subscribed to my podcast, and they were outraged. Outraged. They're like, Jody, we have trauma based on what happened to our cousins. The fact they were savagely murdered.
Yeah.
And now this person, they just say, okay, you can go out there. Well, we don't feel safe. We don't
Yeah.
feel safe. And so I think, unless you've been a victim of a crime and something so savage like this, it really can really just completely rock your world. Like, what do you mean you're letting someone out like this? Look at all the
Mm-hmm.
people who think O.J. Simpson was guilty and he's walking around.
Uh-huh.
That bothers people too. Even
Is there
though,
anybody that thinks O.J. Simpson was innocent?
well, the a
Yeah.
jury didn't convict him. Now, whether
Yeah.
they thought he was innocent or whether they thought the prosecution didn't just make their case,
Right. Yeah.
Um, but I mean, it concerns people, and certainly we saw OJ. He did commit another crime,
Yes.
a crime of violence.
Yes.
He held a gun, and basically he was convicted of a kidnapping charge.
Yeah.
When you prevent someone the ability of free movement, you are essentially kidnapping them. And so,
Not a good dude.
perpetrators can continue to act out, just because, you might have served your time for one crime doesn't mean that if the circumstances come again and you've got that lack of empathy or you've got that narcissistic personality, you're not going to look out for number one again.
Right. Well, in 2019, it's pretty recent, after 33 years in prison, the state parole board grants both of them parole because obviously you can't let the person out that was convicted of the murders and not let the person out that was an accessory if you're believing the verdict. So Phyllis says, it was joy, it was wonderful, but ICE had to pick them up immediately because they were both being extradited. Now, when they said she was extradited to Canada, I was like, I guess I missed the part that she was born in Canada.
Canada.
Yeah. So that's where she had to go. He says they were steps apart in the ICE terminal, but they never saw each other, which was wild. She goes to Canada. He goes to Germany. He comes to Germany like he had just solved
Like a
World
hero.
War IV. A
Yes.
total hero. He's like, it's great. He got his passport. He's a free man. We see him talking to the press. He goes all over. He's become like a media, star. But Elizabeth's release, they said, she was more quiet. She went to Canada. Phyllis went and saw her. She has a good relationship with half siblings on her father's side. They have requested she does no interviews about this. She has honored that. Her brother Howard on the mother's side was never sure of her innocence, and we see that clips from back in the day. Mm-hmm. And Phyllis says there's a big group of people here in Lynchburg that believes she was there at the scene of the crime. The people that I know in Lynchburg, more so my cousin than my aunt, because my aunt is my cousin is about the age, Elizabeth Haysom. So if they say he was born in 66, that would have meant Elizabeth was born in 64. So my cousin was a year older than me, so she would have been born in 67. So they're all around the same age, right? And my cousin has said, like, she and her friend, they're on it. They know all the details of this case, and most people in Lynchburg do believe she was there. Now, whether she was there alone or with him, right, who knows? But
the cigarette to me is the big thing.
Me
and
too.
The hair in the sink and taking the shower, to me, that's her. She felt comfort there.
Yeah. Yeah. So now we get kind of the end. We're in Germany, and Jens is moving to his new apartment, and he says he's not running away. He goes on a publicity tour. He's a media star. He's signing his books. He says Elizabeth is the real killer. And then we see him on a talk show where they say, so they ask him a question and he doesn't really answer. And they say, do you have to be careful what you say legally? And he says, yes. And I thought that was interesting. Why was that?
Because I think she plans to sue him for defamation.
Yeah, especially, yeah. Mm-hmm. So each of them say that the other person did it alone. There's
Correct.
No middle ground.
Correct.
And it comes down to who do you believe? So we see some of their writings. And Jens says the writings and the letters that you see from that time reveal nothing about who did it.
Oh, I think it reveals everything.
And then they show an interrogation where Jens accidentally says, on our trip to Bedford. And then he immediately says, I didn't mean to say that, right after he says it. Like he catches himself because it's not on the script. Mm-hmm. And then they come up with the information that we didn't get at the beginning, which is just a Netflix twist that we love. Howard, the brother from the mom's side, had told that mom said that Jens and Elizabeth were planning to visit them that weekend. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So Your thought is, I'm asking, your thought is they did it together?
I do think so.
You
I do
do.
think so. I do think,
I
yes.
just believe him so much. I don't know why, because I've fed into whatever he's giving me, that I think she did it by herself.
Well, I I think the fact that he was so devoted to her and so manipulated by her, I just think he would have been there to help her. And he would have been, the knight in shining armor. And then I could see her saying, "You go in and do it, honey. I don't want to talk to them anymore. I don't want them to say any last thing," that kind of thing.
I'm just going to sit out here and smoke my merits.
Smoke my cigarette
Mhm.
and I'll come in once they're dead. And the fact that he wrote about, I got the dinner scene all planned out, and I just don't think, given that he would have hung the moon for her at that time,
Yeah.
that he would have just been like, "All right, honey, have a good trip. See you in a few hours." I just
Yeah.
don't believe it. I don't believe it.
That's
And
a good point that they didn't get out of each other's sight, that they were so codependent.
they were. And the fact that they fled together, and the fact that, again, the dog comment, I come back to that. Somebody hit a dog. I
Yeah.
mean, why would you insert that unless you
Yeah.
were there?
The dog thing is weird. It's the back and forth on, is the sock thing true or not? But like you said, we never saw what her foot looked like with the sock.
Correct.
And the movie ticket thing, because he was a pack rat, so he had kept all these things where she was just sort of like, I went to the Rocky Horror Picture Show. She like, I don't know. I just don't know. I just think that at this point, it's been so long. And for both of them to stick to this story for so long of their separate stories when they were really together. And were they smart enough to say, like, what we're going to do is point the finger at each other, and then perhaps neither one of us will be convicted because people won't
We'll
know who
we'll
did it?
create we'll create
Yeah.
create mutual doubt. That could be, and that's the thing. They may have relied on his superior intellect to say, well, if we just tell conflicting stories,
Yeah.
these rural cops out here, they're not going to be able to figure it out. We're smarter than all these people, and they're
Yeah.
not going to be able to prove it's us. And
I thought
there
the rural cops did a pretty good job. I
well,
don't,
except for that, the receipt
except
on
the Marriott.
the
Mhm.
Marriott, that to me, now, obviously, given the time, had this been done today, we would have had computer technology in the cars. We would have had potentially cell phones. We would have potentially had
Yes.
cameras along the route and satellite imagery, and
Yeah.
an Amazon truck that was making a delivery in the area that had camera systems. I mean, and the DNA technology is so much better now, that to
Yeah.
be able to pick up even the most microscopic, even smaller than touch DNA, we can do that now. And so, it would be totally different today.
Thoughts on murder weapon? Because
Well, the knife,
he's like there's no murder weapon.
well, if you're driving back to DC, you got that Potomac right there, and, I mean, any cornfield along the way.
Yeah. And that's interesting too, because you see a lot of this on TV and stuff, but I don't know how often it is that we're like, well, there's this 4 hour drive back and forth. So we're going to search every single inch of it for a possible place to throw. It's interesting that they didn't, or it wasn't included here, that they didn't ask, like, okay, so she said this. So what did she say she did with the murder weapon? Or if he did it, what did he say he did with the murder weapon? And then tell that to investigators, and then they could find it. That's not
Well,
included at all.
that is a very good point. And you're right. That is a key element. Where is the murder weapon? And that's one of the things that comes up in Koberger. It's like, okay, Jody, when they analyze his cell phone and they drill down on the telematics of that Elantra, are they going to find GPS technology that shows along that circuitous route where he went to before the night of the murders? Did he go scope out an area to dispose of things and burn
Right.
clothing and get rid of a knife? I think, that was something, we don't have that kind of technology back when this crime was committed. But had they had that, had cars had computer systems where you can pinpoint when a car stops, like we saw in the Murdaugh trial, and when that phone went flying out of Alec Murdaugh's car,
Mm-hmm.
all those things now that we can find and determine, okay, here's where they stopped. Here's where a weapon may have been disposed of. We just didn't have that back then. And now it's much harder to get away with something like this.
It would be really hard, I think, with everything going on. It would be very, very hard for somebody to think of every single thing to get away with murder. And when you talk about the Koberger, you guys, that's the Idaho killings, with the four students. Everybody knows that. But when you think about that, I've listened to you on Kate's podcast every time you guys talk about it. I'm so fascinated. And we talk about that, and you think about this is what he was studying. He was getting a PhD in criminal psychology, I guess. Criminology. So he's studying it. So in his mind, assuming he's the killer, he thought, I can plan the perfect murder because I am 4 steps ahead. But that he didn't, because
he didn't. And to me, a lot of the factors that tripped him up, assuming now he's innocent until proven guilty, but he is the accused and he's been charged. I think a lot of the factors that tripped up the perpetrator were things you cannot control. You can't control that the person in the Elantra tried to park in front of the house and there wasn't parking there. And there had been on the previous passes through the neighborhood. So then they had to go around the back. You can't control the dog barking. You can't control that there were roommates in the house, and that I believe the cell phones of the victims were starting to go off from those other roommates, who we now know at least Dylan was awake and was hearing some things. Did they reach out to the victims? Hey, what's going on in there? I hear crying. Are you okay?
Right.
It would be logical for the victim's cell phones to be getting text messages coming in, to getting Snapchat notifications, to be maybe even phone calls ringing. I think all of that, and the dog barking and the dog becoming alarmed, and perhaps what I'm hearing is that there may have been some audio picked up on that exterior camera on the nearby residence that was 50 feet outside of Xana's bedroom. If either of those victims cried out in pain, that potentially could have been picked up. It could have been very loud. He may have been concerned that, hey, there's a residence 50 feet away. Someone might hear something. Someone might come. I got to get out of here.
Yeah.
And maybe the plan wasn't to kill 4 people. Maybe it was simply supposed to be one sexual assault murder, and the others just happened to be wrong place, wrong time.
Yeah. Yeah, that I heard you talking with Kate this last week about it, saying that they're trying to push the trial to this summer, and then they were saying we're not even going to be ready till next summer, 2025.
Correct.
That's insane. That's insane.
Well, I think there's so much discovery in this case when you talk about all the digital evidence, all the videos, all the phones of the various victims, of Brian Koberger, of the roommates. You're talking about all the, you have to look at all their social media accounts. Did they have communications? Did they have likes? Who else? They got to put all that picture together. They've got to look at the geolocation data, because it's going to be like a Venn diagram. They're going to overlay, okay, where was Koberger and where were the victims? And how often did they intersect where they were? Were they at the student union together? Were they at the Greek restaurant together? Were they at a coffee shop together? Was he stalking them? And they just didn't know. He was just the guy sitting in the back of the cafe keeping an eye on them.
But that's going to take a year and a half?
Made personal contact.
Another year and a half?
Oh, absolutely. To get all that digital evidence and overlay it and marry it up. Absolutely. To get all the cell phone pings and the geolocation data and then marry it up with the technology from the Elantra. It's extreme. It's a lot. It's a lot to do. And to get it where, because you have to be very, very specific, and I mean, you got to be accurate. You get one shot in court. So you have got to have it down to, okay, here is within so many feet of where he was standing at this particular time, and match it up to satellite time and all that data. It's very specific. And then you've got potentially you've got the DNA evidence, you've got all the blood spatter evidence, you've got potential latent footprint evidence coming in. I do think that circuitous route of the Elantra, I think we're going to hear more about that. Remember, everything we know to this point is what's in the probable cause affidavit, and that's all pre-arrest. We don't know about any bombshells they found through the search warrants and after arrest. And sometimes, and at least in my experience, that's when I found my best evidence, was after I had arrested someone and executed a search warrant.
And then you think at some point, if they are showing him that we've got all this, we've got all this, we've got all this, that he would be like, okay, so maybe we don't have to go to trial. Maybe he'll just admit it and plead to 4 counts of manslaughter, whatever keeps him in jail forever, you know?
I think, quite honestly, I think he will have his defense attorneys fight tooth and nail for him.
Mm-hmm.
But a lot will come down to whether or not investigative genetic genealogy is able to get some of the evidence seized, tossed. That's ultimately why they're pushing so hard for this investigative genetic genealogy, because they want to prove, look, this was a key factor in identifying him as a suspect, and that's not conveyed in the search warrant. So therefore, this was a misrepresentation to the judge, and therefore all the fruits of the poisonous tree, fruits of a poisonous search warrant, should be tossed out. Thus, they want to get the knife sheath tossed out, because then you get the DNA tossed out. So I think they will pursue all of that, but if they are not successful, and if there is potentially, like, did he wear a body cam? I'm strongly thinking he may have.
That's so fucked up.
It is, but we have a case going on right now in Alaska where the guy videotaped his murder.
God.
And so, you know, I think eventually, if it comes down to where everything's going to come in, I think Ann Taylor will have to sit down with Brian and say, look, I don't have an alibi for you. Driving around isn't an alibi, and no juror is really going to buy that. And when we sync up the Elantra with the cell phone data, with your DNA on the knife sheath, if all of that is going to come in, I can't guarantee you a positive outcome here. So the best I can do for you now, Brian, is if all this is coming in, I can maybe go to the prosecutor and say, if you'll take the death penalty off the table, you'd be willing to plea.
Yeah.
And maybe he'd be willing to do that. Maybe he won't. And he's the boss at that point. It's his dice to roll.
Is she a public defender?
She is. She's appointed.
Man. She's like, I just thought I was coming in here to defend somebody on some traffic tickets and a DUI, and I got this guy?
Look, here's what she's not telling you. She's making money hand over fist right now.
How?
As the public defender appointed to this, because they're paid hourly. It's not just she gets paid as part of on an hourly contract basis to do this. And let's face it, she's never going to have to work again. She's going to be the Marsha Clark, and she's going to write a book about this.
Mm-hmm. You're right.
So she's got $1 million book deal coming. And probably, I mean, I look at some of those attorneys in the Gilgo Beach case, with the Gilgo Beach serial killer case in New York. The attorney for the wife, Huerman's wife, he's getting $400,000 from, I believe it's Netflix, for that documentary they're making. So these attorneys have profitability. They see dollar signs in the future.
Yeah,
they have the ability. This is going to forever change their life. So yeah, there's a lot of money in this for them. So she'll work as hard as she needs to for the next 18 months, 2 years, but then it's a gravy train for her after this.
The I always want to say Gigolo, but it's like Gilo Beach murders in New Jersey. How many murders have they tied him to? I know that there was like 12 women found along this one area, but they initially tied him to 3 or 4.
Well, he was initially charged with 3, and then they just superseded, and he's been charged with a 4th. And the 4 that he's been charged with it is the four women, Maureen Brainerd Barnes, Megan Waterman, Melissa Barthélemy, and Amberlynn Costello. They were the four known as the Gilgo Beach Four. And the
Okay.
reason for that, they were all found in 2010 along Gilgo Beach in Long Island. And they were all wrapped in this unusual burlap fabric. And so
Right.
the fabric is what really keyed into law enforcement. Like, okay, well, clearly this is the same perpetrator for these four because you have the same exact fabric that's used to camouflage their remains. Now, whether they're going to be able to link him to the other victims who were found in close proximity there on Long Island, they're working on that. Now, all the forensic testing on everything taken out of his home and his office and the vehicles. There were two vehicles. The vehicle he had way back in 2010-11 timeframe, and then his current vehicle. It would be unusual, even though all these bodies were found in 2010 and 2011, it'd be unusual for a serial killer to just stop and not go somewhere else and just either
Right.
find a new dumping ground
Right.
or potentially he had homes in other states. Maybe he committed crimes in other states.
And that remind me that fabric, it was either something to do with his job sites
Well,
or
they
came
believe
from
it
their
was
house.
duck blinds. He was a hunter, an avid
Okay.
hunter, and apparently duck blinds are used to camouflage the hunter while you're
Right.
out in the swamps trying to hunt the ducks.
Yeah.
And so they believe it was part of these duck blinds, which are camouflage
Yeah.
type cloths that help camouflage the hunter from their prey.
That's interesting. Well, yeah, we've got so many cases to talk about, and it's so interesting when you're talking about when you think about Jens Soering and you think about Brian Koberger being always the smartest person in the room and quick to tell you how smart they are and make you feel stupid and all that. It's interesting, right? And Elizabeth Haysom, the same. Very, very,
Well, it's very socially awkward. I mean, who
yeah.
goes around and says, "Well, I'm smarter than you," or "I'm a genius"? People just don't do that. No, people with a finger on the pulse of normal personality. I
Uh-huh.
mean, that just it's so arrogant, and the fact that they just seem so oblivious to how arrogant that is and how off-putting that would be. It really
Does it remind
speaks.
you of like the Ted Bundy of it all? Because Ted Bundy, yes and no, in that he was obviously always one-upping and smarter, but he was the opposite. He was trying to woo people with his personality,
Well,
right?
and he was, but he also the thing about Ted Bundy. I mean, he got away with a lot of what he got away with because of his looks. I mean, he had, the movie star kind of looks. He was a very
Yeah.
attractive man. He was articulate. He didn't look like, the creepy guy you see, in a back alley that you're like, "Oh, let me get to my
Like
car. Let me
Koberger
grab."
looks creepy.
Well, he does his eyes. People have said his eyes are what really bother him. But I think if you didn't know better and you didn't know what he's affiliated with doing, and you saw him in a photo spread without his eyes bulging out, when he looks more normal, when he's just sitting there in court, I don't necessarily think people would pick him out of a lineup and say, "Oh, there's your potential killer of four college students,"
I think of him in a classroom and being
Right,
so
in an
arrogant
academic,
and being like,
professional
that guy's a
setting.
jerk.
Well, I
Yeah.
do think it's interesting that he studied under Dr. Catherine Ramslin because she's the preeminent expert on serial killers and wrote the book on BTK. And I
Mm,
wonder, like, I look at what BTK did and how he would taunt newspapers and send in letters to newspapers, kind of like the Zodiac killer did. And I kind
mhm.
of wonder, there's all this speculation, was Brian Koberger Papa Roger on the internet chats?
Right.
Was that kind of modeled after BTK? Like, is that the modern day spin on it? And did Koberger say to himself, all right, well, I have an interest in killing. That's why I'm studying criminology, not so I can be in law enforcement, but so that I can better commit crimes.
Yes.
Did he envision himself, well, let me come up with the most fantastical thing that Catherine Ramsland, she will want to study me because I'm so, you know,
Uh-huh.
the latest or the most,
Yeah.
horrific. And, certainly, I'm very curious if he wore a body camera. If he wore a body camera, would someone like Catherine Ramsden want to say, okay, sit down with me, let's watch it. Tell me what you were thinking here. Tell me what you were feeling here. Because that's exactly what she studies.
And he was studying under her.
And he was studying under her. Exactly. And if she writes a book about the BTK killer and wants to know what his motivations and thoughts were, why wouldn't she want to do that with Brian? Especially if he wore a body camera.
It would be very hard to live in that space all the time and sleep at night
It's
without
very dark.
a couple of
It's very dark.
Xanax to knock you out. I mean,
Well, and,
yeah.
I wonder, because there's been speculation that at least one of his sisters was kind of starting to poke around and ask some questions of him.
Really?
Why are you wearing gloves all the time here on Christmas break? And you drive an Elantra, you're 10 minutes down the road. What about you? I mean, there's questions about that. And I will be very curious if and when we do go to trial, if the sisters will have to testify. Did you notice anything? Did you suspect anything?
And the dad who was riding with him.
That's
Yeah.
another one. He went all the way across country with them.
Yeah.
Looking back, what does he see? What does he know? What was peculiar to him? What did Brian tell them about his job as a teaching assistant out at Washington State? Did he let them know, hey, my funding's being cut, I'm being fired? The writing's on the wall, I may not be going back.
Yeah.
I think it'll be really interesting to see.
Jody, I love talking to you. I could talk to you for 2 more hours about this particular Netflix documentary, which is still even Kate wrote today. She was like, "Who do you think did it?" I was like, I cannot say, okay, I definitely think they were both there. I can't. But I like your theory that she's outside smoking and sent him in, and then she came back in and did a couple of stabs and walked out. But I still can't say.
Well, and I think you brought up a very good point about the murder weapon.
Yeah.
That really, were either one of them polygraphed?
Yeah.
I think that's another factor.
Surely somebody said, okay, if she said she did it, what'd she say? Where'd she put the weapon? And then they said to her, all right, so he came back. Where's the weapon?
Right.
And then nobody looked for it,
Right.
I don't know. Well, I really, really appreciate you discussing this documentary with me. And
thank you for having me on.
I knew I'd get you at the end with some Koberger questions because
always got Koberger thoughts.
Always got Koberger thoughts. But tell all my listeners, if they haven't heard you on Kate, we want to know where we can hear more of all of your theories and all the cases that you cover.
Yes, I have my own podcast. It's called Caught in My Web. It's on patreon.com. I'm on 5 days a week covering breaking true crime news. And then
5 days a week?
5 days a week. And then twice on the weekends
Dang, girl.
month, I do Cold Case. So 22 episodes a month minimum. And so, yes, it's a good deal.
It's a good deal.
You can find me on patreon.com. And then on social media, I'm on Twitter, TikTok, and Facebook at Jodene Weber, and on Instagram at Weber Jodene. And then you can check out my website, jodeneweber.com, for safety products to help improve your personal safety.
Okay, cool. And I'm going to put the links here in the show notes so everybody can just click and find Jody. But 5, 6, 7 episodes a week on Patreon is a real good deal.
Yeah. You get your money's worth.
Dang. Okay, and everybody, just as a reminder, please follow me over on Instagram at Pink Shade Pod. On TikTok, it's Pink Shade Podcast. Got a lot of funny reels and things over there. Just always out here begging people to follow me, so thank you for that. And I'll be back later in this week on Thursday. We'll have an episode up with Mandy Slutsker. We'll be talking Bravo. It'll be a lot lighter than this. So thanks, everybody, and I will talk to you soon. Again, thank you, Jody.
Thank you, Mary Payne.